Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you, everyone. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to have a reason to get all dressed up. My dad is a tailor, and he gives me suits every time I see him. And so they've all been basically collecting dust during this pandemic. So really, you all are doing a big favor for him. Before I get started, I did want to give a short preface, mostly regarding disclosures and limitations. And speaking about this topic of Asian American mental health, it's a pretty tall order. And I think it's important to express that even though I'm a mental health researcher and I'm trained to minimize bias as much as I can, everything I'm presenting today and any data that I present today ultimately comes with my or their own biases. Every data set comes with particular research methods that are selective sometimes, and biases exist in their data collection. So in even the particular ways that I choose to frame this subject and the talk today are ultimately shaped by my own biases and experiences. So I am not some chosen spokesperson for the Asian American community. And as I will talk about in a little bit, I do not intend to represent or speak about mental health fully on behalf of all Asian American communities. It's an impossible feat, I promise, at least in 40 minutes. I also wanted to note that this talk specifically, I'm not using this common umbrella term, AAPI, or Asian American or Pacific Islanders. And that leaving out Pacific Islanders was not an oversight. Pacific Islanders experience really unique challenges and have specific needs that NCAT wanted to be careful not to gloss over by using the umbrella term, especially if they're not making explicit efforts to uplift those specific needs. So for this reason, this talk is going to be more tailored to Asian American communities. And so even though I will be speaking generally about Asian Americans and mental health, I think it's also important to share some personal disclosures that affect my biases and limitations. The first is that I am trained as a community psychologist. So what that means is I see the world and very differently, perhaps, from even a clinical psychologist or social worker or therapist. And for those of you who don't know what that means, basically community psychology goes beyond this individual level focus and beyond traditional psychotherapy when it comes to promoting mental health and well-being. And so we focus more on the kind of bigger picture, interpersonal, community, and structural systems levels to address well-being for communities. I also identify as Vietnamese American, a child of the Vietnam War and refugee diaspora. Both of my parents were Vietnamese refugees and immigrants who moved to the US in 1975. And I was born and raised in upstate New York. I did live in Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia for about 4 years in my early 20s, and then lived and studied there every summer for another 6 years. So I do feel a strong sense of identity in regards to my Vietnamese heritage and identity. Culturally, I like to think that I kind of move fluidly between these Vietnamese and American identities, and sometimes even try to center that Vietnamese or Asian identity more when I'm living in the US and want to more effortfully decenter whiteness in my life. And the last thing I'd like to disclose is that I identify as queer and non-binary, which for this talk isn't explicitly relevant. I think I could do a whole different presentation just about mental health for LGBTQ plus Asian Americans, but because I wasn't asked to talk about that, I won't. But what this does bring up that seems worth mentioning is that gender and orientation and other things like age, religion, immigration status, and class, etc., all permeate every single part of this presentation, even though I won't be explicitly mentioning all of those things on every slide. So even though today I will be talking about mental health in the context of race and ethnicity and Asian American identities, it's good to remember that it goes beyond that. And all of these other identities also have a lot to do with how we access everything more equitably or not. another disclosure, my eyes are very watery right now because it's gotten warmer here and I think my allergies are starting. So I will be using this handkerchief very frequently to wipe away tears, and just know that I'm not overly emotional during this presentation. So why focus on Asian Americans? Let's quickly review a few demographics to sort of set the stage here. There are over 20 million Asian Americans in the US. That's about 6% of the overall population. They are the fastest growing racial ethnic group in the US. The population grew 72% between 2000 and 2015, from 11.9 million to 20.4 million. And the fast population growth suggests that they will eventually be the US's largest immigrant group. There is no single country of origin group that dominates the Asian American population, but the largest groups are of Chinese, Indian, and Filipino origin of descent, followed by Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. There is incredible amount of diversity in the Asian American community. Those 20 million Asian Americans can trace their roots back to more than 20 countries in Asia, each with their unique histories, cultures, languages, even regional languages and other characteristics. And it's worth taking a moment to really let that sink in. You know, going back to my limitations, I'm very cognizant that doing a talk about Asian Americans as a racial group has a lot of limitations, and quite frankly, it runs the risk of oversimplifying and homogenizing all the diversity of identities and experiences within this group. I could give another long talk about the history of the term Asian American and how race as a social construct was created, but I won't. If you don't know that history, I would highly encourage you to look it up. I also want to mention that there is a lot of other diversity of experiences and identities within the Asian American community, and it makes big differences on mental health and well-being. So for example, there's the differences of experiences between first versus second versus third generations, differences in experience among immigration statuses, also the unique challenges faced by biracial Asian Americans or transracial Asian American adoptees. There's just so many unique differences of experience and identities within the Asian American community to cover them all in a short 40 minutes. And at the same time, talking about Asian Americans as a racial group and community can actually be a helpful starting point for us. And what I'm trying to do here with you all is to kind of move beyond this binary either or thinking and move towards more both and thinking. And the reason for this is that many Asian Americans do have shared experiences of minority stress due to racism and xenophobia, and therefore have shared experiences of discrimination, violence, oppression, and other similar struggles for liberation. Many Asian Americans are subject to the same stereotypes, such as the model minority myth or the perpetual foreigner, which I'll talk about very soon. And so for all of these reasons, and also so we can keep this talk within the time constraints, talking about mental health in an Asian American context seems to be a good starting point. Okay, so why talk about Asian American mental health? According to a recent SAMHSA study, 14.7% of Asian American adults in the US have reported having a mental health condition or illness. That's over 2.9 million people. Serious mental illness rose from 2.9% to 5.6%. That's about 136,000 people. For young Asian Americans ages 18 to 25, and that was between 2008 and 2018. Suicidal ideation and attempts are also rising, especially among Asian American young adults, with suicide being the leading cause of death for Asian Americans ages 15 to 24 in 2017. And I wanted to mention here too that additionally, Southeast Asian refugees are also at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that is associated with the trauma experience before and after immigration to the US. And one study found that up to 70% of Southeast Asian refugees receiving mental health care were diagnosed with PTSD. And you can imagine how many other folks did not, seek mental health care. Now, one of the most striking things that we know about Asian Americans is that they are 3 times less likely to seek mental health services compared to other Americans, despite all of the prevalence of mental health distress. Asian Americans are also the least likely racial group in the US to seek mental health care services. And of those people who have mental health conditions, those 2.9 million people, only 25% of them receive treatment. Now, there's a handful of concepts related to the general Asian American experience that can be really helpful for us to better understand Asian American mental health. And I'm just going to kind of briefly do an overview on 2 of them for now, which some of you may already know about. First is the model minority myth, and second, the perpetual foreigner stereotype. So I don't know how many Asian American mental health talks you've all been to, but honestly, if anyone's going to be talking about this topic, you just can't ignore the old model minority myth. Basically, when I talk about the model minority myth, I'm talking about this stereotype and misconception that paints Asian Americans to be law-abiding, diligent, obedient, compliant, and intelligent people. The more desirable, successful, or model group of minority people in the US compared to other racial minority groups in the US. A few points I want to make about the model minority myth. One, it overgeneralizes Asian Americans as this monolithic culture. 2, it ignores crucial disparities and struggles of many Asian American communities and invalidates the enduring hardships of a lot of Asian American groups. As you can see in this little pie chart here, overall Asian Americans are better educated than the general US population, but when you break it down by ethnic group, there are huge disparities for Southeast Asians when it comes to getting education. And remember when I talked about how all research is biased? Well, the model minority myth is based on selective, misleading data that fails to acknowledge the diversity of Asian Americans and disparities between different Asian American communities. Next, the model minority myth pushes a really harmful narrative on both Asians and other racial minorities in the US. It was designed to pit minority racial groups against each other and was initially used as a tool by politicians to gaslight Black and Brown Americans. The praise toward Asian Americans that come from the model minority myth doesn't aim to empower the Asian American community, but to put down other racial minorities, to create tension and division between Asians and other people of color, and weaken that BIPOC solidarity as a whole. So it's really, really harmful to this struggle for racial justice. Next, it also erases historical racism against Asians. It suggests that the US has always been this welcoming place for people of Asian descent, in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Japanese internment camps in the 1940s, the mass lynchings of Asian Americans in the 19th century. Finally, it puts really overwhelming pressure and places high expectations on young Asian Americans. This has contributed to a lot of increased stress, anxiety, depression among young Asian Americans, especially in college students when they're unable to live up to these standards. And we'll circle back to this one soon because it has huge consequences for Asian American mental health. But yeah, there's just so much to learn and unpack here about the model minority myth. And I could really just do an entirely different presentation, just focus on this. But if this is your first time hearing this though, I once again highly encourage you to read up and do some research and get informed on your own time. Now, if you've never heard about the perpetual foreigner stereotype, but you are here and identify as Asian American, then chances are you deeply know the experience, through experience, what this stereotype is. this stereotype casts Asian Americans as fundamentally foreign individuals who will never be able to fully assimilate into American society. And it often manifests in subtle and not so subtle microaggressions, where Asian Americans, even if they're second or third generation, they're often asked these questions like, where are you from? But no, really, where are you really from? And as a side note, this literally happened to me last weekend, and I just said, I'm from New York. And this person was very unpleased by my response. But yeah, there's really harmful rhetoric. Anything from, wow, your English is so good, to what's your American name, or all the way to, if you come here, speak my language. So all of this, it assumes this cultural belonging elsewhere. So even when any of these things are said without ill intent, these questions are othering and deeply problematic. Okay, so remember before I mentioned that Asian Americans are the least likely racial group to seek mental health services. So before we get into the myriad of reasons as to why that might be, let's go over some of the possible explanations for why Asian Americans may experience mental psychological distress that could lead to mental health issues. So there are a lot of sociocultural factors that come into play here. Many Asian American families with more traditional values, they place great value on the family as a unit. So for some families, each individual has a clearly defined role and position in the family hierarchy and is expected to function within that role, kind of submitting to the larger needs of the family. And these obligations based on strong traditional and cultural values, they can prevent individuals from really pursuing their own interests. And it's important to note that there are vastly huge differences of obligations and very unique stressors between gender, between men and women, which, deserves its whole other thing. And also unique stressors for folks who are more gender diverse, like transgender and non-binary folks. In a similar vein, there is a lot of social pressure from parents, families, and communities, as well as self-imposed pressure to live up to that model minority stereotype. So for many Asian Americans, there's a lot of this parental pressure to excel in academic life and become a highly skilled professional, regardless of the emotional, social, or physical toll it takes. And that can lead to a lot of anxiety or feelings of inadequacy or shame. And conversely, there's also self-imposed pressure to live up to that model minority stereotype as well. Another common source of mental distress, I think, is related to complex identity development of Asian Americans. The complexities of acculturation and assimilation, how there's difficulty in balancing multiple different cultures and developing this strong bicultural identity. It's not an easy journey. And second generation Asian Americans can face a lot of challenges struggling to balance their familial ties to traditional cultural values with the pressure to assimilate to mainstream American society. And you can imagine that this is difficult when you have to hold and embrace cultures that have very different and sometimes opposing values. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention intergenerational trauma. This idea that many children of refugees or immigrants, for example, who didn't experience the same trauma firsthand, can still very easily internalize their parents' unprocessed trauma that shows up in different ways. And many refugees and immigrants also experience legacies or histories of trauma from war, from imperialism and colonialism. And these experiences of extreme and toxic stress can actually be passed down from one generation to the next genetically. Finally, not that this is an exhaustive list, very common sources of mental health distress for Asian Americans are microaggressions, discrimination, and violence, most often motivated by racism or xenophobia. And we'll be talking about this a little bit more on when we talk about Asian American mental health. in the context of COVID-19. Now, although there are deeply rooted systemic challenges within the American mental health care system as a whole, there's also certain cultural and structural barriers that affect service provision and quality of care more specifically for Asian American communities. So of course, I want to bring it back again to the model minority myth and think about how it relates to this external social stigma and internalized self-stigma when it comes to seeking mental health care. You know, the model minority myth, it perpetuates this idea that Asian Americans do not need mental health support because they can take care of themselves. And this interacts in a really complex way with that cultural value that places a lot of value on emotional self-control and kind of that ability to resolve psychological mental health issues by yourself. In a lot of Asian American households, children grow up controlling or hiding their emotions because, you know, if you're too emotional, you may be perceived as someone who complains too much and doesn't try to solve anything for themselves. Similarly, some Asian Americans who, you know, families who adhere to more traditional cultural values, they may consider it shameful or embarrassing if anyone other than family members has information about their personal problems. And so there's also an internalized stigma that keeps some Asian Americans from ever seeking mental health support because of that worry about saving face or bringing shame to their family and communities. There's also this idea that previous generations suffered worse circumstances and trauma, and so it's shameful and disrespectful for children or young adults to share or even acknowledge their struggles, knowing that others survived or endured so much more. And so, in other words, younger generations can often feel guilty about sharing their mental health struggles, fearing that they may seem insignificant when compared with their parents' and grandparents' hardships. And then there's that filial piety and collectivism and hierarchical relationships angles to all of this that all create a really strong burden of adhering to these expectations, which can increase stigma and shame if and when a person doesn't meet them. And I also want to mention here that although a lot of Asian American faith and spiritual communities offer really protective and built-in social support systems, there are also many religious communities that can perpetuate stigma around mental health that can delay treatment. So for example, by characterizing mental health or illness as divine punishment or bad karma. And this is especially true for Asian American families who turn to their religious leaders first for mental health support. And in a similar vein, there are many traditional and non-Western medicine and indigenous healing practices that often emphasize the integration of mind and body in maintaining health and promoting health, which is certainly a very good thing and something that I, full disclosure, believe in completely. But I think we have a long way to go when it comes, I think we have a long way to go when it comes to like decolonizing medicine and healing. However, the point I want to make here is that for some Asian American communities, traditional medicine is often considered the primary treatment, and that can result in delaying or refraining from seeking mental health care. So once again, just encouraging you all to not think in binary, you know, it has to be either or ways. Don't cancel me because I said something about traditional medicine, but really rather just think about what possibilities open up and close down with certain ideas. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna go back. Lastly, there is one other thing, a lack of understanding about mental health in general. So for example, Asian Americans, particularly first generation immigrants, may not understand that mental health is part of a person's overall well-being and can be treated like other medical concerns. And also just think that it's, you know, only about serious illness. So just as an example, in Vietnam, the term mental health is largely still understood as referring to very severe psychiatric disorders, and those who suffer from them are considered dangerous to the community. So as a result, many older Asian Americans deny or neglect mental health issues when they come up. So moving on to social and structural barriers. And remember, this isn't an exhaustive list. But the first one I wanted to mention here is low Asian American cultural awareness among service providers. Service providers are not always trained to understand and address culturally specific mental health issues. And this lack of awareness and training in cultural humility and awareness has historically led to the misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis of mental health issues for Asian Americans. There's also this fear of being misunderstood because of cultural experiences and backgrounds, as well as the fear of racial discrimination. So you can imagine that, especially during COVID-19, Asian Americans may be reticent to seek care for mental health concerns for fear of exacerbating that discrimination. And then there's language barriers that can also prevent Asian Americans from seeking care. Over 13 million Asian Americans were born in Asia, and overall, 32.6% of them are not fluent in English. And additionally, 60% of Asian Americans aged 65 years and older have very limited English proficiency. So this disparity between high demand and poor availability of linguistically and culturally appropriate mental health service providers is a significant gap in accessing treatment. There's also, of course, the many concerns over the high costs of mental health care that undoubtedly lead to lower rates of help seeking and treatment adherence. In 2018, 10.8% of Asian Americans lived at or below the poverty level, and 6.2% were without health insurance. And lastly, some Asian American immigrants may not seek necessary mental health care due to fears of jeopardizing their status, their immigration status, or their citizenship application process. So fast forward to today, or this past year rather, with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. And everyone, regardless of race and ethnicity, is striving to cope with anxiety and fear brought on by the pandemic and the social isolation precautions needed to reduce its spread. And with that said, Asian American communities are also experiencing unique challenges and additional stressors due to COVID-19 that may be compounding mental and psychological distress. And so there's a huge body of evidence that shows social isolation and loneliness are highly associated with poorer physical and mental health. But also, there's other unique challenges. For example, there's because there's a pandemic, doesn't mean that the effects of the model minority myth and the overwhelming pressure for young Asian Americans to achieve ever stops. You can imagine how difficult it may be for some Asian American college students who are now having to live under their parents' roof again with all of its complex mental health stigma and what that lack of privacy also does to their willingness to reach out for mental health support. There's also a surge of rising reports of domestic violence calls right now, particularly for Asian American women. Despite the surge in reporting, it's likely to still be very underreported because of cultural factors that often prevent Asian American women from seeking help, as Huynh talked about at the beginning of this workshop. And then, of course, Asian Americans have increasingly become the target of discrimination driven by xenophobia and racism. And the consequences of this are evidenced by declining sales at Chinese and Asian-owned restaurants and businesses, nearly deserted Chinatown districts. This is one of my favorite ones in New York City. And there are also reports of increased bullying in schools for Asian American students and verbal and physical violence that targets Asian Americans. I read a quote in a report very recently that said, "A group of boys at my school targeted me and my friends and called COVID-19 the Chinese virus and covered their mouths and pretended to cough when they were near us." So this anti-Asian discrimination and violence feels important enough to talk about on its own because we are hardly seeing any news reporting about it. The mislabeling of COVID-19, a virus that does not discriminate based on race, ethnicity, national origin, or citizenship, but the mislabeling of it as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or Kung flu by our former president was a blatant misrepresentation and did nothing to stop or slow down this pandemic. Rather, the language only contributed to anti-Asian American discrimination and stigma and gave people an excuse to harass, assault, and murder Asian people. As Representative Takano from California states, words have consequences and actions by political leaders have consequences. And we're seeing the consequences of the use of terms like Chinese virus or Kung flu in our hate crime data. Here are a few other sobering statistics. Back in September, NYPD data showed that there was a 1,900% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in New York City in this past year. An organization called Stop AAPI Hate found that there has been nearly 3,000 incidences of anti-Asian discrimination across the US since March of last year. And I think it's important to, again, question these numbers and think about how Asian Americans are likely underreporting because of all the cultural and social factors that might make one reticent to report hate crime incidences. So because of this, I think the number is probably much, much higher than this. I wanted to mention that this might be the first time you are hearing about this level of anti-Asian violence if you are not following any Asian American news outlets or social media handles, because the mainstream media just simply doesn't spotlight stories about Asian Americans. And if this is the case, once again, I highly encourage you to just read more about it and educate yourself. Okay, so what can we do? As a community psychologist, I'm always thinking about these kind of multi-pronged, multi-level interventions and strategies and approaches. So I thought it would be helpful to think about what we can do in terms of individual and community levels, and then more structural systems level actions that we as a society can take. So first, at the individual and community level, the first thing I wanted to mention is doing your part in destigmatizing mental health for Asian Americans, and especially during the pandemic. I encourage you all to seek support when you need, because it is a lie that we ever have to do this all alone. And with that, it's important to mention that mental health treatment is not just for severe mental illnesses. The bar for seeking treatment is, especially during the pandemic, is pretty low. So you should seek support if you haven't been feeling like yourself for over 2 weeks. Things like feeling low energy or fatigue, or change in appetite, or difficulty sleeping, or trouble getting to work or class on time. I also want to encourage you to push back when you hear something stigmatizing about mental health, especially in our Asian American communities. Next is to do your work to reject the model minority myth and perpetual foreigner stereotypes. So the first thing to think about is being mindful and catching that impulse to assume anything about Asian Americans. Question why you're overgeneralizing or essentializing right now. Also educating others on the dangers of perpetuating the model minority myth and the perpetual foreigner stereotypes. One thing I would say is, I know it's super tempting and almost second nature, but try to stop making yourself the butt of the joke around your white peers or colleagues by playing into some model minority myth or perpetual foreigner stereotype to give white people a laugh. Think critically about why you feel like you have to do this and what the repercussions may be of doing this. Next is engaging in self-care and community care. In order for us to be able to keep engaging in this struggle and to care for others, we have to shore up our own psychological and emotional resources and engage in this radical self-care. And I put this quote that I really love here as a reminder. In the language of Audre Lorde, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And the one thing I would point out here is that because the Asian American community is so vastly diverse, we need to remember to use culturally salient coping strategies and encourage culturally salient coping strategies for different people. We also want to lean into community and social support right now, especially people who have maybe similar identities and experiences to us who can help us feel more validated and not alone during this pandemic. Perhaps finding other Asian American community. One of the greatest protective factors that we know for Asian American mental health is having a strong sense of pride in one's ethnic and racial identity. Simultaneously, we need to resist all of these attempts that larger society makes to divide us in the Asian American community, to put groups, to pit groups against each other within the Asian American community, or the Asian American community with other POC communities. This is an opportune time for us to ally with other Asian American communities and other POC communities and recognize our shared struggles for liberation. And this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but the last thing I really thought was important to mention is the importance of reporting any acts of discrimination or violence or hate crimes that you may see and experience. I was verbally assaulted earlier in the pandemic out in the public. And if you're like me, I had no idea where to report it and definitely did not want to go to local authorities or police. But recently I came across an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, which was formed in response to this need to collect better data. I would encourage you to report something there so that they can use that data to advocate for community needs and policy change. I just wanted to say a few things about structural and systems level strategies to consider in regards to addressing Asian American mental health right now. And I can't stress this enough as a researcher, but the research community really needs to collect better, more robust, disaggregated, that's like, should be in bold, health data on Asian Americans. There is such a harmful and inaccurate narrative of homogeneity in these communities that is perpetuated because of insufficient research or data. And even though collecting large samples of data on Asian American ethnic groups is pretty difficult, it's so essential for crafting truly responsive public policy, especially health policy. And the next is kind of an obvious one, but wow, our country really needs to provide affordable access to mental health services for everyone. The Affordable Care Act played a critical role in increasing Asian Americans' access to mental health insurance. But because of high costs, too many Asian Americans still remain uninsured or underinsured. And immigration status is, of course, another barrier to accessing affordable mental health services. So we need lawmakers and policy advocates, anybody who works in the policy realm, to keep working towards universal health care, eliminating underinsurance, and expanding coverage for immigrants to improve access to mental health care. We also need more cultural humility from service providers working with Asian Americans. I think cultural incompetency and bias among healthcare professionals, they pose a lot of additional barriers for Asian Americans, as I talked about earlier. But for example, in 2017, 13% of Asian Americans reported that they experienced discrimination when visiting a doctor or health clinic. And among Asian American immigrants, the problem is even worse, with 1 in 6 people reporting discrimination. And finally, the lack of diversity among mental health professionals also contributes to barriers in the mental health field. Asian Americans as a whole are underrepresented in the US psychology workforce. If you feel called to work in the psychology, social work field and are Asian American, please consider joining me, us, with the less than like 10 Asian Americans therapists that my health insurance was, could access, and the small crowd of Asian American therapists and psychologists across the country. And this is my last slide. So I didn't want to gloss over resources, so I'm just going to keep this up here for a little bit until all the transitions are done with the breakout groups. But these are just a few more resources related to Asian American mental health and well-being. Some are more directly related to anti-Asian racism during COVID-19. And just in that bottom corner, that's my email. Really highly encourage and welcome anybody to kind of get in touch, and if you want to talk about this more, I'm very happy to geek out about it with you all. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Fiona.